This is Monraj and Rosenbaum are humans. Today you have Marianne Monraj, Benjamin Rosenbaum, and Darius Finisar, our hardy producer, is joining us on the show today. And we are going to do a reading recap episode, an author recap episode. I don't think we have a title for this, but we realized, or really Darius...
Wheel of Text.
Yeah, basically what I did was you guys mentioned a lot of authors, a lot of writers and books and stories, and I kind of pulled together some of the ones you've mentioned the most or have a particular liking to, or maybe not liking, but you guys talk about either way.
Or a fiery anger at.
Fiery anger, yeah. So I'll just say some of these texts maybe you don't particularly like, but are still that you still talk about and are important to the podcast. So there's not particular order, but I think some of the ones you guys mentioned the most are near the top of the list. So I guess we could get started if you want.
So we're going to, we just to tell the audience at home, I, for at least, have carefully not looked at the list until now. So game show style, reality show style, we will be surprised by here's what you talked about on the podcast.
Yeah,
that's the plan.
And hopefully this will give you guys some books to buy and books to read. So
and books to burn if you encounter them.
That's right. That's right. We're recording
this.
Books.
It's okay.
I'm not sure when this will be released, but we are recording it in early December. And so I know my semester's just ended, and as soon as I finish grading my papers, I am planning to drown myself in holiday reading. So it's going to be great.
I realized quickly that when you said I don't know when this will be released, you were sort of doing a holiday thing, like it's a December thing, so you could buy but because I had just said like you could burn the books you hated, I and because we're living in dystopian times, and because our release schedule has been so dramatically, like I just edited an episode for release that was like a year and a half ago, so it's like I don't know when you'll hear this. I was like, I don't know if there still are books or bookstores or libraries to encounter any of these books when you're huddled in the wasteland.
That's right.
Here's our take on them.
Yes. After the aliens come,
and
after we're all uploaded to the cloud. That's right. So.
That's right. The podcast, the one remaining, there's like a thumb drive of this podcast as the last vestige of 21st century civilization.
If we manage to actually broadcast it, theoretically, the sound waves will be traveling across the universe, right?
Yeah, sadly, I think it's all IP packets at this point, but maybe we should set up a rig and point it at Ariadne, Liaise 581 or...
All right. Darius, you better start us off.
Okay. All right. So the first author that you guys have both love and have talked about probably the most is Samuel R. Delaney. And books that you've mentioned are like Stars in My Pocket, Like Grains of Sand, I and Gomorrah, Babel 17. And also there was an essay you guys have mentioned a few times. I think it's called About 7,750 Words in his Jewel Hinge Jaw collection.
Yeah.
So
that's, yes, we have talked about that a bunch. That's the sort of, it's got a great theory of reading. I'm sort of shocked we haven't mentioned Dahlgren or Nova. Those are pretty formative.
Yeah,
Dahlgren, you guys have mentioned Dahlgren.
And I teach Neveryon, so that's another. I think it's maybe not Neveryon. As widely known, but definitely worth considering. I don't know, Ben. Do you want
when we invite Delaney on, maybe I'll pitch him on my doing a Neveryon powered by the apocalypse role playing game. I feel like that's a. I feel like there should be some licensed Delaney role-playing game property.
So I don't know where I would say to start with Delaney. I just taught finished up my 400 level class on writers of color in science fiction and fantasy, and I had one student who was particularly interested. I did have them all read I and Gomorrah, the title story from the short story collection I and Gomorrah, which I teach pretty often. And if you're looking for like a single short story of Delaney's to try, I think that's a pretty good one. but I had one student who was really interested in reading more about Delaney, and then I was like, oh, where do I send him next? Do I give him the rest of the short story collection? Do I have him read? I think I first may have read Babel 17, and I don't know if it's Babel or Babel. Maybe it's Babel. I don't know.
I always said Babel.
Yeah, I mean Babel makes more sense,
know.
but given the language aspect of the book, but we could ask Chip. Samuel R. Delaney goes by Chip. If I say Chip, that's why. Yeah, I don't know. You know, I certainly wouldn't throw people in with Dahlgren unless I already knew that they liked that kind of thing, right?
Well, so we should say a little bit what kind of thing. So Samuel Delaney is a ferociously intellectual author who started out in the 60s and 70s, I think, late 60s, right? As a prodigy, like very young, bursting on the science fiction scene, winning all the things. And his early books tend to be, like even beginning with like Empire Star, tend to be short and exciting and very and you know, very innovative in terms of the world building and so on, but also hewing very much to the sort of adventure story tradition, very psychedelic. So even those books, which definitely have like a villain and a big bad and things are happening, maybe not a villain, moral complexity, but like, you know, a starship adventure. We're going to harvest the center of the sun, and there's the blood rivalry between the, you know, and those early books. So they're like fast reads, exciting, and lots of stuff going on. They're all already have all this interest in like all these intellectual postmodernist themes of self, and they're all and you know, society being socially constructed, and he delights in using only a few words to obliquely call into question your certainties, you know, where like and to invert lots of things. A great example is in Nova, I think in relatively few lines of dialogue, you realize that people in the 25th century completely believe in the Tarot, and for very good scientific reasons, and think of, you know, early like 20th and 21st century people as sort of superstitious savages for not having understood how that works. I don't know. And there's lots of things like that that are sort of clever inversions and then his work got more and more ambitious. Dahlgren, the reason Marianne is saying, I don't know if I would throw everyone at it at the beginning, is it's you know, it's science fiction's Ulysses. It starts and ends with poetry that merges into this sort of psychedelic phantasmagoria of a book. But, you know, and then the middle of it is not all phantasmagoria. The middle of it is, however, very much like a literary novel in a lot of its concerns, sort of a picaresque, like kid, a young man, you know, it's very 60s in some ways, in the sense that it's sort of like there's a breakdown of society, there's this metaphysical collapse going on in this city, and so all the certainties are gone, and so there's a lot of, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and poetry, and ambition, and yearning, and whatever. And like Delaney's also really interested in like you know, the sort of classical like character who encounters the high and the low of society, and the, you know what I mean, sort of wanders among the transgresses all these boundaries, and then Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand, which is hugely ambitious. Also Trouble on Triton, which is again is sort of like these later books are not as concerned with like the traditional plot structure of like, you know, we have a mission and we have to succeed or fail, and the hero will, you know, they're often like domestic, they're often you know, there's a lot of people wandering around being ambushed by impromptu guerrilla theater, and like family negotiations about what room the guests will get and stuff in these wildly imaginative world building worlds. And also Delaney, I think, was a leap forward and perfected a tradition of storytelling in science fiction, which is often, I think, the beginnings of it are associated with Heinlein, and Heinlein was a big influence on Delaney, where you didn't do info dumps, but rather you dumped the reader in the middle of things and you were throwing things at them. And Delaney ramped that up to a degree where you're just immersed in this world, and every sentence is giving you information, which has symbolic weight and is informing you and teaching you something, but not actually telling you everything, just giving you little bits of world building to hold on to that you have to construct this in your mind. And then the Nevrion series. I don't know. Do you want to talk about Nevrion? I've just been talking for a while.
You have been talking for a while.
Entire podcast about Delaney.
I mean,
Obviously,
I
very
think
formative influence.
I think I want to jump back a little bit, just because you covered a lot very fast. So just to highlight a couple things you said, I do think the early books. See, Jewels of Apter was the first novel in 1962, and followed by a couple that I think are less well known. And then I think the next one I read was Ballad of Beta 2, and then Empire Star and Babel 17. And I think Empire Star, which was is one that I think is where I ended up on what I was recommending to the student as a starting point, in part because he was particularly interested in issues of class. And I think he's Marxist. And so Empire Star was a good, seemed like a good starting point for, here's this kid getting caught up in complicated economic, political, governmental shenanigans with a good dose of theatricality. And it's a very accessible, it's very fun, it's very pulpy. I think these early books, I would say, sort of marry the pulpy traditions of science fiction with Delaney's intellectualism, right, and political concerns, right, and and even in the early books, experimentalism in how he handles prose, and he just
although very restrained in the early books, right? So more restrained than the later books. I mean, still like virtuoso prose.
And you just see that he's playing with it in ways that I think a lot of writers weren't. It wasn't their project, and they weren't interested. And I think we'll be talking about Le Guin soon, and I think Delaney and Le Guin, these early works, I tend to think of them together in that they were often making similar moves in terms of politics, in terms of prose style, but the reading experience is very different. And part of it, I think, have you run across this metaphor of like writing as a window, and it's either a clear glass window or a stained glass window, and the idea being that, like, someone like Alice Munro, who writes very minimalist prose, she tends to let the characters and the stories, their stories, be the meat of what you're getting, right? And she doesn't give you dazzling prose that might be like a stained glass window, beautiful, but could also be perhaps distracting, as opposed to someone like Nabokov, right? Or Faulkner or Joyce, or Delaney, right? All of whom are very willing to use dazzling prose to, I think, hopefully enhance the rest of what they're trying to do. This is something I struggle with a lot as a writer myself, because when I first started writing, I really enjoyed being playful with my prose, and then I kind of pulled back on that to a more minimal style. So, and sometimes I feel like, am I betraying Delaney by not like trying to do more with that?
Well, we should decide how much we want to digress, but I do feel like I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I think there's definitely there are definitely writers where you are like struck by, conscious of the prose, the fact that you're reading, like the attention is called to the fact that you're reading, versus ones where you have this immersive experience. At the same time, I'm kind of skeptical. Like that's like there's a piece of there that I'm skeptical about. And maybe what I'm skeptical about is the notion that, there's a stained glass window and there's a clear window, because the clear window assumes that there's something you're looking through the clear window at. And in a way, like it's all like, you know what I mean? Like that's a sleight of hand. Like there actually isn't anything but the words on the page, and the fact that, and also it feels very culturally bound. Like I wonder, like at a particular moment, a particular kind of prose is transparent.
Sure.
But like, I already wonder whether prose that was transparent in the 30s feels transparent now. You know what I mean? Like in a way, it's
I agree, but I don't know.
There's something there. I'm not saying there's nothing there.
Yeah, I mean, this is like when we're talking about the pulpy writing versus the more experimental writing, right? I think there's this kind of there's maybe a question of like, how hard do you want the reader to work is also a piece of that, right?
Sure.
And that's why I don't necessarily want to hand someone Dahlgren unless I know that they're going to delight in the work, right?
Yeah. But
you know.
but what I think is interesting about this is a digression, but what I think is interesting about the stained glass versus clear glass metaphor is it's like, how hard do you want the reader to work begs the question, who's the reader? Because I feel like if you go now, like I feel like because stream of consciousness, like Virginia Woolf at the time was dramatically weird, like demanding a lot of the reader to read that stuff. But her techniques, like stream of consciousness, has gained ground.
Right.
And so now I think if you go back and read a pulpy writer writing at the same time as Virginia Woolf, who was just like trying to sell a lot of books and like, the perils of Penelope kind of thing, you're more aware of the prose. Like now, reading it now, you're like, wow, this is so like Victorian, like hilarious, Penny Dreadful. Whereas you actually do slip into the hours in a way that you don't, or into, no, that was the movie about the thing I'm thinking of, Miss Dalloway. You'd slip into Mrs. Dalloway in a way you don't, you know what I mean? So it's like a moving target. So
I agree.
Anyway,
I absolutely agree. At the same time, I think, like, look at YA, right? I recently, a few years ago, tried to hook my daughter on
Wrinkle
in Time, right?
You've said,
yeah.
I'm going to ring a little bell every time we say something we've said before on the
podcast. But just to recap, recap the relevant bit is that it seems to me like, it seems like you were kind of laying out an argument that like, readers today perhaps are more comfortable with stream of consciousness. Like you could make an argument that we're more sophisticated readers, and that things that were
I don't think there is more sophisticated.
I'm not saying you made that argument. I'm saying one could. I want to kind of point out that that's not. Someone could jump to that from what you said. So I just want to clarify.
But I think Wrinkle of Time is less stream of consciousness than Hunger Games. I think Hunger Games is more, in that sense, to a modernist, to someone from the 1920s, Hunger Games is more sophisticated than Wrinkle in Time.
Right. That's
so you know what I mean. But it's also more immediate, and it's more.
Yeah. It's more pulpy. Is what I was sort of going to get at, which is that and if you look at like. The YA fiction that I grew up on often was very similar to adult fiction of the time, and in terms of prose style. And what my kids are reading is often much more pulpy, which I just think is an interesting shift in terms of.
Well, and pulpy, I mean, pulpy means a lot of things.
Yeah,
I think the thing you're particularly talking about is I think that there's a. And you see this in music as well as in prose. There's a pendulum swing between high emotional intensity, dramatic sensationalism, and sort of austere minimalism, but that goes back and forth. Like Dickens, super like sensationalist and dramatic, and then we get to Hemingway, very austere and muffled and repressed, and then you know what I mean? And then Burroughs, I don't know. So it's not, that isn't a linear thing. That's like fashion,
it is,
in some sense. And so anyway,
moving
on. Let's get back to Delaney.
What
were you going to say about later Delaney?
I don't know. I don't know what I was going to say about later Delaney. I mean, I teach Never Yawn in part because it is very accessible. I specifically teach Tales of Never Yawn, which is a set of linked long stories, and it gives me a great way into talking about race, about gender, about power dynamics, about civilization, which is one of the big sort of themes that both Delaney and Le Guin spend a lot of their time and energy on. What is it to be barbaric? What is it to be civilized? I think it's huge in their work. And I don't know. That's what we end up talking about a lot in those books. So
also love in Never Yawn the fact that it's so, I mean, by the time, Never Yawn's interesting because I think it's after those big, very ambitious, like we're going to throw out, the Triton, Dahlgren, Stars in My Pocket that are very much like.
Never Yawn is 79 to 85.
Never Yawn in some ways is a return.
Yeah.
In some ways it's a return to pulp because it's got this, love affair between the dark liberator Dom and the, I don't know, whatever. But the it also is very overtly and explicitly like, because that has all these like what do you call them, epitaphs, epigrams, like at the beginning of each chapter there's like a quote from like Foucault or Lacan, or like it's very much like this sword and sorcery thing, which is also this like crash course in European post-colonial, post-modernist, whatever philosophy. And I don't know how post-colonial is. Anyway, but I loved that, of course. I mean, basically, Delaney was just absolutely my jam when I was a teenager. I mean, this was just like the most exciting thing. This collision of worlds, and all of the the intellectual and emotional drama, and he also the other thing is that Delaney is kind of an interesting arc because he sort of left science fiction for a while. But not entirely. Like there's some later science fiction works, like They Fly at Chiron. But like but there was sort of a moment when he was like, and almost kind of like a screw you, I'm out, like you can't fire me, I quit moment, where I think he was having trouble. He found it very difficult in the publishing industry, and he A, went to academia, and B, went to porn, like where he wrote these extremely transgressive big tomes of like over the top.
This is, we're talking about like Madman and Hog and so on, right? So
which was a big like sort of, he kind of stopped writing science fiction and started writing those in kind of a dramatic way.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested in asking him what, from his point of view, what prompted that shift. I do think like as a sci-fi reader, I was like, oh, where is he gone now? I'm not sure I can follow him here, right? This wasn't what I came to Delaney for, but I don't know. I suspect for him, he may not see it as much of a departure as readers experienced it as.
I mean, maybe not, but I'm just thinking of interviews and stuff I've read where I think it had both creative, and I think it was a creative project he was really interested in, that he felt very strongly about bringing to light these things that are taboo, like talking about people who are off the page, we are not permitted to talk about this sort of person and what they do. Like that's not literature, that's not acceptable. We pretend that doesn't exist. And he precisely wanted to humanize and fully realized. He wanted to write absolute, like full realized, completely centered portraits of people who are very marginalized, right? And in really like shocking, outrageous, transgressive ways for the I mean, I think there was a moment, like particularly with Hogg, where he's like really like, it's not just that he wants to neutrally detail, he's like looking for the thing that will piss off like heteronormative America the most, right? And I think that was accompanied by like things that I've heard him say about like, well, I don't know exactly what the timing is, but like about how it was not like, it's also not an easy country to live as an artist in, and like the publishing, I don't know, there's a both creative and a publishing industry relationship thing going on, I think, at that point. But anyway, let
me add, I just want to be sure before we move off Delaney, I want to note that he's got two memoirs that I just adore, The Motion of Light and Water and Heavenly Breakfast, and the first one I've reread. I reread every couple of years. It's just very powerful. And to see a brilliant young Black gay man writer trying to navigate his life and his writing and his publishing life in that era. And he tells it beautifully. It's just a pleasure to read. And Heavenly Breakfast is about this period where he and some other young artists were living together in a commune in New York, I believe, and their relationships and navigating that. It's a great little slice of a particular moment in American arts, I guess, is
also a later work that is not autobiographical exactly in the same way. It's as much critical as autobiographical, but Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is about sort of gentrification of New York. And I guess the last thing to say, we're spending all our time on Delaney. It's actually a Delaney episode. We'll be rapid fire for the next few, but I think he's a very formative influence on both of us, and his fingerprints are all over my work. I often write sentences where I'm like, there is no way that sentence would exist had there not been Delaney. And I mean, in some ways, I think almost when I was, that we've talked about sort of the period where I burned out because I was like expecting so much of myself, I think I like probably counterproductively identified with Delaney. Do you know what I mean? I was like, well, I'm going to be a science fiction prodigy too, and or a literary whatever, like transcend whatever. And so yeah, like I think I probably had to like learn the hard way I wasn't Delaney.
Well, that's a little bit of like the stained glass window thing for me. Is maybe, you know, I agree with everything you say about it, but I also feel like maybe that metaphor let me take a little of the pressure off, because I was loving Nabokov as well at that time, and like pressure to be dazzling in prose is a very high bar, and I think it was getting in the way by doing anything else, and so stepping away from that and being more minimalist it let me write in a I did like
okay, moving on. Enough about Delaney.
Enough about Delaney. Is there ever enough about Delaney? But yes,
there's not, but we have limited. Yeah,
I know. All right.
Bujold.
Yes. Wait. So Louis McMaster Bujold is a writer that Marianne has been close to Marianne's heart, and she also recommended me her Vorkosigan Saga series when I was doing my thesis project with her. So I'm not sure how much Ben has read up on Bujold or is as familiar with Bujold as Marianne, but
I do not think Marianne would have permitted me to read zero Bujold. No, actually, I think I already had read Bujold. I don't think you were the. I think it's somebody. I have another friend who's also a big Bujold fan who pressed things on me. I like Bujold, but I have only read like, I don't know, I think I read 3 or 4 of them. I have not a completist, but I get it, and I see her connection to your work. I mean, I see your work's connection to her. I think it's really interesting, and I like, you know, I mean,
well, so Darius has read some. So Darius, I'd be curious what your take on Bujold is at this point.
Yeah, I read I think most of the first book in the Vorkosigan series with Miles, and I found it interesting how I think like the power dynamics, because he isn't quite, you know, your typical like dashing, strong, like handsome, like protagonist. I think he has to overcome a lot, especially in terms of like his physical health, and also the way he navigates like his relationships with the people who are supposed to serve him, because he is kind of like has like a lordly position in his society.
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't see a lot of people talking about Bujold in disability politics ways, which is sort of surprising to me, because the first book, The Warriors Apprentice, is the first book featuring Miles in that series, although there are 2 previous ones featuring his mother that are excellent. But you could certainly start with The Warriors Apprentice and then go back for those. And it's the start of a several book series, but they are very much centered on his disability, that he's born with these severe disabilities, and he is brilliant and passionate and compelled to service because of this tradition of service in his family, compelled to greatness because he has, you know, he's the son of a great man, and you know, it very much reminds me of A.S. Byatt's Shadow of the Sun novel also interrogates that kind of relationship. Like, what do you do when you're growing up as the kid of somebody famous, right? And brilliant and world-changing.
Also reminded me a little bit of Dune, too. Had a little bit of Dune.
Yeah, and so I don't know. I'd like to see more people looking at how Bujold handles disability issues in this. And it's a little bit exceptionalism. It's a little bit like Miles is so brilliant that he can just, and so charismatic that he can mostly just overcome the things that are getting in his way, or he finds workarounds. He's very Kobayashi Maru-ish, to tie it to Star Trek, right? He's very like Jim Kirk in, like, I know this is supposed to be a no-win scenario, but I'm going to reprogram the computer and get around it, and then I'm going to win. And it takes like 8 books before he actually is forced to face it. So he does that. He does eventually, but it's quite a ways in before Bujold makes him deal with it. So deal with failure, and I do have limits to my capabilities. So I think if you're interested in that kind of topic, what's her name? Nicola Griffith, also in her
Hmm.
one of her recent books, and I'm going to blank on the title. She lives with chronic illness, and she writes about that in a recent book. I think it's a there's some
It's
interesting.
not Hild, is it?
Not
Hild?
Hild. Hild is
Different.
great, and the sequel is
Hild
out
is
or will
brilliant.
out be
Hild
soon.
should be on our list.
Yeah. No, Nicola's book. I'll look
Hild
it
is
up.
a
It's
very important book.
It
Yeah,
is,
you could talk about it too if you want.
Yeah, So Lucky
Next.
is the one I was thinking of,
Haven't
which
read it.
is it's a essentially mainstream novel about it's about a woman who is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which is what Nicola lives with, and then there's kind of like a thriller element to the novel, so with maybe somebody's trying to kill her, et cetera, so on. So anyway, but it's really good. It's very well done. And just thinking about, I don't know, as I get older and am discovering I have limits, irritatingly, this kind of text.
It's interesting because I mean I associate Bujold with you, and it's interesting how you are both like as a writer, I think that there's a way in which it's a strong direction for you to go in a Bujold direction. Like there's this there's these sort of broad scope and like all these sort of profound human relationships, all this family drama, this sort of sense of lineage and the complexity of societies, and her sort of very inclusive, or like sort of very this view of all these different societies that are truly and dramatically different from one another, and but not caricatured. Like they all you have a real sense of what it's like to inhabit the one or the other of them, and they're also inventive. I mean, sort of, I see that resonance in your work, but then also it's kind of funny because of course you are also a lot like Miles. the impatience with anyone telling you can't do anything.
No, okay, so the things I love about Bujold, I'll just give a list for the people who are like, should I read her? Should I not read her? So absolutely the big complicated societies that are very different from each other, that are but the ways in which she embodies them in little individual stories and makes them real. That's how I hope to write, and that's very influential on me, and I think it's really effective. And there's a specific moment, I think, that where she just got me, and it's at the end of one of the novels, I think one of the early Barrier novels, where there's an epilogue, and there's been this big space battle, we've been following our hero through all of this, etc. The book ends, and then there's a little epilogue, and we meet these two people who we've never met before, and they're out in space, and they're collecting the bodies on the that are out in space, and after ships have been blown apart, to return the bodies for burial. And and then there's a moment where one of the people, they don't know each other, the two people working this job, and one of the people, they find a young woman, and she pulls out a wedding dress and starts dressing this corpse in this wedding gown. And the other person is like, I'm trapped on a ship with this freaky person. Like, what's going on here? And then as she talks, you learn that this was her daughter, and who died in the war, and she's sort of envisioning like her life could have gone this path instead, right? Like, and it's just, I don't know, it's so beautiful. It doesn't connect to any other characters as far as I can remember. It's just like I know you've been all caught up in battles
of the
and
world
ships and so on, and
this is the cost.
This is the cost,
like,
and this is what is happening on a micro level and the important level, right? Like, while all the big things are happening. And I think for science fiction and fantasy, that's a really important lesson that we seem to need to learn over and over again in this genre.
And it's particularly this grounding of, because there's this sort of escapist. I mean, you're sort of having your cake and eat it too, because there's this kind of Kobayashi Maru and all that stuff is this Miles or whatever as this swashbuckling hero, and the idea that there's like the fate of thousands and these hard decisions, and it's all this excitement. It's sort of the excitement of war fiction in a way. Right. And the tradition of that sort of adventure thing is that it's really boys playing pow pow on the playground. Like you're not present at the cost. And so to have this and that you have that fully, like you have Miles's genius strategy move which blows up 5 ships, and then you have the woman dressing her daughter in the wedding dress, and that's like in the floating it's void scoured body, and that's that's
like the heart of Bejewelled's work for me, right? Like she gives you both. She's she's published by Baen, which does a lot of traditional military fiction, and in some ways her work really fits well into that. It's exciting military fiction, science fiction, but it's so compassionate and human. And same thing with her fantasy. She does the same kind of moves with her fantasy. So I don't know.
We should move on, or we're only going to get through like 5 of the 50 people on this list.
That's right. So
we're going to need to do rapid fire pretty soon.
Yeah. So next on the list we have Ursula K. Le Guin.
Sorry,
well, that's not going to be rapid fire.
It's not going to be rapid fire. Maybe we should skip over Darius. Let's pause on Le Guin. Let's hit a couple others, and we'll come back to Le Guin. How's that?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, we could just have the first half of the episode be like the big four or something.
Let's do some fast ones. I want to power through.
Okay.
Power through.
One author that Marianne has mentioned a lot, and I think is pretty formative, is Diane Duane, especially her Star Trek novels. I know you talked about one of them in particular.
I can be quick with Duane, I think. So in some ways, because she and Bejeweled are working in a similar mode a lot of the time. So if you like one of them, you'll probably like the other. I first encountered Diane Duane, I think, through her So You Want to Be a Wizard series, which I adore, children's / YA fiction. And there are several books in that series, and there's an oath of wizardry as you get these powers and you try to protect the world, but there is real loss and sacrifice in her books, which I appreciate. She balances the power with real consequences and difficult situations. And I think, in particular, I think, there's that whole thing with kids fiction where the kids are off doing exciting things and the parents don't know anything. And I always felt like, or the parents get killed off or whatever. And she makes a move in the first or second book, maybe it was, where the kids have to actually tell the parents what's going on and deal with the consequence of that. And that was shocking to me and brilliant. Right. And, now as a parent myself, I'm like, oh my God, if, if my 14-year-old wants to go off and save the world, how am I going to navigate that? And they're a lot more powerful than I am all of a sudden. Right. So that's very interesting. For science fiction, for Star Trek, I think she, The Wounded Sky, My Enemy, My Ally, I read a lot of Trek novels when I was growing up. I'm a huge Trek fan, and hers just stood out. Her and Peter David, I think, stood out as being, bringing a lot of humanity. I say humanity, but I like, that includes things
and vulcanity
like, and exactly. Like John M. Ford's The Klingon Reflection, right? Is like, he brings fullness of characterization and being to these various species, right? And Duane does that. Duane also, I guess I would say, if you're at all interested in religion, she generally has a religious thread woven through her books in a way that, even though I'm not religious, I found very moving a lot of the time. And for an example, in one of the Star Trek novels, they break through into a proto-universe where there is a proto-god, essentially, and they have to kind of navigate teaching the god ethics and what does it mean to take care of your people when you have this much power.
I think we talk about that in one of the first, one of our first recorded episodes, which I don't know if it's the first one of the, let's figure out where, maybe in the show notes, point out which episode that was, but we talked about that.
I believe it was the What Are Humans episode.
Yeah. So a lot of kind of like navigating what is, use of power.
Okay, this is less rapid fire than.
No, I'm stopping. That's what I'm stopping.
advertised.
The only thing I will say is she's got one other series that was important, and I'm blanking on the title of that series. So I'm trying to Door into the Middle Kingdom series, Door into Fire, Door into Shadow, etc. So on. So I won't even get into it, but that's another strong series that I would recommend to people. There we go. She's written a ton of stuff. She's written a lot of tie-in novels and so on, but those are the ones I'd start people on. Ben, I don't know if you've read Dwayne or have an opinion.
I have not. I've never read a Star Trek novel.
Oh, well. I know.
I read Star Wars novels when I was a kid. I read Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Yeah.
And I was that age back then.
Yeah.
I haven't read one recently.
All right. That was my quick Dwayne thing. So, Darius, you got anything for Ben?
Yeah, maybe Ted Chiang. Was that going to take a while?
Well, here's the thing. It's weird. So now I was noticing that Ted Chiang is on this list, and it's funny because this is the transition where we go from. I mean, Marianne had Chip Delaney as a teacher, so it's not like we've never encountered these people, but Ted is our friend, so it's a little it's like a little odd. Ted is, of course, a leading light of science fiction and change the world and everything, but it's kind of a different proposition. We have also an episode recorded, which we're going to be releasing either before or after this. We either will have already released it, and it'll be in the show notes, or it's coming up. So wait for it soon, with Ted Chiang. So and with some of the other people on the list. So maybe those are the people we should rapid fire. Ted is amazing. He's our buddy, and he is I think it's a source of embarrassment to him, the extent to which his fellow writers regard him as like a national treasure. So
I think Ben and Ted are close friends. I am friendly with Ted, but I mostly know him, through sci-fi convention circles. So I don't know that we have a strong personal relationship. What I'd say about his writing is that it's very intellectual. It is works like the one that got made into a movie. It was made into the movie Arrival.
Stories of Your Life.
Stories of Your Life. Thank you. I think his work's really interesting.
Story of Your Life, the collection of Stories of Your Life.
Yeah. Right. In that, from what he has told, what he's talked about, I can't remember if he told me this directly or if it was in an interview, but he came up with the idea for that story as an idea, kind of worked it all out as an idea, wrote it all out, and then went back in and put in the humanity, right? Put in the characterization.
I think that may be something I've told you about. I told you because I think on this podcast, because that was my experience that was so fascinating about critiquing his stories, was that very often the first drafts were like these sort of very intellectual, like working out all the problems, and then he would go back. But that being said, if you haven't read Ted Chiang, it's emotionally like that story emotionally wrecks.
Well, I think that that's the thing. No.
It's consummate mastery, but it's just fascinating that he does it in that order. Well,
that's what I mean. It's really interesting to me that he even can do it in that order. I don't know anyone else who works that way, and it's very that's probably what I find most impressive. I know a lot of people who will do intellectual writing. I know a lot of people who will do character-driven, strong emotional writing. To be able to put them together in that order is fascinating to me, and I do think it's a very, like, that's the story I would point you to. It's very moving. Then I did not think they'd be able to do a good job filming it, but they actually did. I think The Arrival they did an excellent job with translating it.
If you had asked me, like, name an unfilmable story, I would have come up with that one, but they pulled it off. So
so that's I guess that's the main thing I would add. I guess I would also say, from in the course I teach, he's important as an early Asian American science fiction writer as well, right? So he's significant in that arena. And it's interesting kind of thinking about how his work does or doesn't relate to things like Ken Liu's work or Shishin Liu, right? Someone that Ken translated the three-body problem. So if you're interested in that arena, you might look at his work there too.
Okay.
That's all I
Yeah,
got.
and he is if we're gonna I was just gonna skip and say Ted's great, but if we're gonna go there, I would say that he's particularly known for rigorous thought experiments, which then have tremendous emotional core. But and one thing that we haven't mentioned is that he tends to take worlds that we might think of as fantasy worlds, but build them according to these very very rigorous art. So there are things like 72 Letters and Tower of Babel and Hell is the Absence of God that feel like sort of, I guess, formally those are fantastical premises, but they feel like science. They feel like they're worked out in science fiction, and Exhalation in the new collection, which are all sort of like, taking the notion of the Tower of Babel story, for instance, where it's like they build a tower that goes to the sky and God doesn't want them to, and rigorously very treating that like it's the cold equations or mission of gravity, which yields this sort of delightful effect. Merchant of the Alchemist's Gate is another. Well, Merchant of the Alchemist's Gate, I guess, is straight up science fiction in a way. It's just embedded in the Arabian Nights. So it's the Arabian Nights is the container for closed loop causality.
It has a sort of folkloric feel, a lot of his stories, right? Yeah. But then married to analog style science fiction,
and different. I mean, that one is folkloric. Some of them are folkloric. Some of them are there's a certain element of different genres. I mean, like the Omphalos is very much like this sort of, is epistolatory. I don't know. There's a different. He's just great at inhabiting some prose style and some marrying it to some character. Anyway, moving on.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think we're succeeding at being fast at any of these.
I'm pausing to grab a sweater. I'll be right back.
Okay. So we're an hour and a half in, and we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
We're 47 minutes into recording.
We're 47 minutes into recording. Oh, okay. Yeah. So we had
that's our 45-minute pause. Yeah, that was good. All right, I'm back.
Okay, I just want to point out we've done 5 of how many are there?
Yes, we're gonna go faster.
I don't believe you.
Benjamin, are you doubting my will?
Now I believe you, because now, yes, Marianne, I doubt your will. I don't think your will can accomplish this.
All right, Darius, give us another name.
Thank you for giving me the key to this problem.
Octavia E. Butler.
Okay.
In particular, you had me read her first book in the Xenogenesis series, which I found really interesting and pretty crazy. And then I read her Parable of the Sower many years ago and found it absolutely terrifying. So,
yeah. Okay, I'm going to be brief here. I will say Octavia Butler, if you were going to read one author off of this list, she's the one I would ask you to read. She won what's colloquially known as the MacArthur Genius Grant, and I think she actually was the genius. And I'm really regret that I never got a chance to meet her or talk to her, and I would have loved to interview her for this podcast.
She's
just
she was my teacher at Clarion. So that's why I went to Clarion West that year. And she was also an amazing teacher and really was such a mensch. And she was, tremendously brave as a writer, absolutely uncompromising and unflinching, and just so there's just such a she's masterful, and also everything she does is economically directed at these most profound kind of effects, so there's and it's interesting because she's I think my canon, my trinity is Delaney, Le Guin, and Octavia, and very differently from Delaney, she's never self-consciously dazzling. She's never sort of, not that I would say it's necessarily transparent, but it's like there's just like this economy of like doing exactly what she wants, and this tremendous, like this interesting combination of both daring and humility. Like there's no ego in her writing, and there's tremendous almost like unearthly ambition. Like this, she absolutely goes to the heart of things. And she wrote all these things, like, I don't know, I mean, Kindred is like a Black woman being pulled back in time to save her ancestor who's like a slave owner. And there's all this uncomfortable complicity. Bloodchild is the story of this like very intimate and caring and also completely fucked up family relationship between these humans living on a some alien settlement, and like the aliens who use the humans and breed them to like be the biological vessels they put their eggs in, which is like, kind of with like essentially the way a parasitic wasp injects eggs into some kind of animal as a host. Like that's the biology going on here, and it's this traumatic and life-threatening for the humans, and it's bound up in this connection where like they clearly like this is this mutually codependent relationship where they care about each other. It's just like it's just like she just goes there, like does not take any easy outs, like takes this completely untenable situation and requires you to sympathize with everyone in it. And it's like it's both harrowing and wondrous. So I am very pissed off that she died young.
Yeah, I agree.
We deserved a lot more of Octavia.
I'd add for Bloodchild. I
don't know that we deserve. Let me take it back. I don't know that we deserve more of Octavia. Octavia deserved more.
Yeah. Well, the world could have used a lot more of her.
Yes,
Certainly, we would have benefited greatly.
And also, Parable of the Sower. Sorry, one last thing I want to say is that N.K. Jemisin writes a foreword to the new edition of the Parable of the Sower, basically saying, well, when I read this back in when I was a teenager, I was like, where are all the spaceships? She used to be fun. Why is she writing about the depressing stuff? This is not like this is ever going to happen. Now reading in 2021, it's like, oh my God, she literally called everything.
Yeah.
The dystopia of now, written in the 80s.
Yeah. I have a hard time reading her sometimes, only because it can be so unflinching. I recently was rereading Kindred. I think it was this summer, trying to decide whether I wanted to teach it in the fall. And I got partway through and I was like, I could spend an entire semester on this novel, and I don't know how I can possibly do it in 2 class periods, which is what time I had allocated to it. And 2, we're at that point, we were a year plus into the pandemic, and I was so drained and exhausted, and I was like, I can't make myself keep reading this. I don't think I can assign it to my students, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of heart, though, and there's a lot of it is unremitting. It is unremitting and unflinching and brutal, and it makes you realize how much all of the rest of us take the easy way out. But also, there's a lot. It's never cynical. It's never brutal for the sake of being brutal. There is
generally
tremendous heart.
I think there's a thread of hope that kind of runs through it, right? Like if you're reading Dawn is the first book in the trilogy that I often give my students and that Darius read, and as you're reading through, you're going to, I think, feel like this is very brutal, this is very difficult, but she doesn't leave you in that place, right? She always kind of shines a light at the end that's like, it could end up going in this positive direction, maybe, if everyone makes the right decisions. I think it's well, there's that. There's like that skepticism and not cynicism, and also there's this it's unflinchingly brutal, but the hope is also equally defiant. Her hope is not like a passive like hoping things get better. It's a refusal to accept. The books are animated by hope in the sense of an absolute refusal to accept. Like she's unremittingly detailing the brutality of the world, and then the this and this is how you
indefatigable, like it will never tire. She will never, these characters will never stop fighting.
She reminds me of like Jemison and like the sort of Jemison's response to Le Guin's the ones who walk away from Mamalas, the kind of like, this is how we fight. This is how how you have a core of integrity that even in these intimate, complex, familial situations lets you push back against these social norms that are so damaging. Bloodchild, I will say, is very interesting because my students always want to read it as about slavery. And I think that is how I read it the first time I encountered it as well. Butler said repeatedly that this is a story about male pregnancy and not about slavery. And as I have gotten older, and specifically as I have been pregnant and had kids myself, that makes much more sense to me than it used to. And specifically kind of like the ways in which our society is to large part built on refusing to recognize the risks of pregnancy to women and all of the consequences for that in American politics, etc. Because it's sort of too scary to face, right? Like this is the truth of the matter. And she's like, I'm going to make you look at the truth of the matter because I'm going to put a man in this position, and now you're gonna be appalled and horrified and now take it back. So anyway, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I definitely don't. I mean, I think it would be. It's difficult to read it not as informed by, like there's some. It's maybe a little disingenuous to say that, but I don't think that's her focus. And I think that it's such a. I mean, specifically, we're talking about pregnancy and making a male pregnancy, but that was, I think, the germ of the idea and like where she's coming from at it. But also, it is such an illustration of all kinds of oppression that doesn't have this easy answers. It's not just like good guys and bad guys, and the good guys should win and triumph over the bad guys. It's like it's unsparing about the moral weight of what's going on. You're not tempted to be like, oh, this is okay for a minute, but you're also like, everybody is so entangled and complicit with everybody else. The same thing with Dawn. I mean, the oppression is so damaging that there's not even a safe place to stand to say, well, I'm the oppressed one and I've done everything right, and it's just completely external. Like none of this has gotten under my skin. There's oppression, and that's an external force acting upon me, and I'm the hero fighting back. It's like worse than that. Octavia is here to tell you it does get under your skin, and you do become part of the monster, and you do make these choices because your choices are limited that are, where you can't help but be part of the thing that you both hate and then also come to love because it's all mixed up together. So the alien who's implanting things in you in this terribly brutal way is also like, of course, that is very much about like the relationship between, that's a very gendered, it's these alien species, but it's very much like, well, I do love you legitimately, and also the world is set up so that you're completely terrible to me and risking my life, and you know what I mean, and cannot see that, you know what I mean, or even can see that, but still it's still the norm, or it's, I don't know. So Octavia, unflinching.
We dissolve into inarticulateness because how do ordinary people talk about genius? It's tough. All right, Darius, give us another one.
I don't think she'd like that, but
no, she would not let us off the hook. That's a little bit,
no. Exactly.
Yes.
She would not let us off the hook with that.
That's right.
Octavia is not the least bit interested in her being a genius and you not being a genius. She insists that you also be a genius.
That's right. I could just hear her say, I've never met her, right? But now I'm imagining her saying, come on, Marianne, suck it up. Yes, you could do it. All right.
You are also required.
Yeah. One writer I want to hear you talk more about is Lloyd Alexander. You mentioned him being one of your favorite authors, and the connection I have to him is that I used to watch the forbidden movie of my childhood was the Black Cauldron, and it was so scary, but like, man, I was drawn to that movie. Like it was so like mysterious and like cool, and I know that I think it pulls from some of the novels in his series. So I don't know, maybe you could talk a little more about
it's the second book, right?
Yeah. It's so he has a bunch of books, but the Chronicles of Prydain is the series in question, and the Black Cauldron was it made by Disney? It's an animated film made on the second book in the series. I'd also would recommend his Westmark trilogy, which is not genre, but it's excellent sort of children caught up in the midst of revolution, political stuff. Really good. But I don't know. For me, I think the Prydain is a set of 5 books.
I think it's Prydain, right?
Prydain?
It's all, there's a bunch of, I remember all the Welsh pronunciation
and
explaining all the Welsh pronunciation in the book. I was totally into that.
I did not succeed in that, but so I would say books 1, 2, and 3 are solid and good, and certainly worth reading and enjoyable. Book 4 and 5 broke me and reshaped me and are part of what makes me who I am today. Taran Wanderer and the High King. And I almost don't want to say too much about either one, except that, well, I guess I can say briefly about Taran. In Taran, you've got a young man who is trying to find his place in the world, and it's a picaresque kind of. He goes around and he tries different things. He tries becoming a fisherman. He tries becoming a potter, etc. And so for any young person, I think it's a really great exploration of I see my daughter now at 14 asking, well, what am I supposed to do with my life, and what should I major in, etc. All of those questions. And I think it's a great way through. The bit that breaks, I don't think this is really a spoiler as such, there is a moment where he falls in love with something, but then has to and could happily do this for the rest of his life. It would bring him.
It's definitely not a spoiler since you've already told this story on the podcast.
Well, okay. And then and then it has to acknowledge that it isn't the thing that he's never going to be as good as he thinks, as he would want to be at it, right? It's not. He doesn't actually have that gift, and it's, I don't know. It was very moving. And the High King, I won't just.
It's a really, I mean, I like those. Yeah. I haven't revisited them. It's interesting that I never, I feel like I should have at least tried to get my kids to read them when they were at the right age, but I don't think I did. I have not revisited them, but I remember them being very important, and I remember being super into them. Susan Cooper around the same time. That was they feel similar to me, the Darkest Rising series. But I remember Taran, that series, the one with Black Cauldron and Taran Wanderer. And what's the first one? Anyway, he starts out as a pig boy. It's very interesting the way that I remember even at the time it being distinctive how it handled it often feels like the hero is just temporarily some peasant, but really secretly he's the king, and that's always, and it sort of feels like it is an interesting critique of that, or take on that, where it's I don't even know if I remember it well enough to make this point, but it feels like it's very authentically about being ordinary and being special, and calls that distinction into question or something.
Well, and kind of, no, I think that's right. I think the books are, the first title is not great, the Book of Three, which I think is not very memorable. Then the Black Cauldron, and then the Castle of Lear. And we haven't talked about Eilonwy. The series is also notable for having Princess Eilonwy as a very strong female protagonist at a time where there were few of them in literature. And I think what you say about him being ordinary and introduced as the pig boy, and then there's this princess who he somehow knows, is cast that into sort of high relief at the start of the series. I think as it goes, what it's asking you to consider is that sort of both we can all be special, but also being special isn't like a free pass to glory. Being special is about sacrifice and having integrity and so on. So it's I don't know. It's a good series about adulting in the end as well.
Yep.
So
okay, moving on. That was Lloyd Alexander.
Yep.
What's next?
Sure. Let's see. How about Orson Scott Card? I know I know Ender's Game is really important to the field, but you guys have your disagreements with the author.
I mean, he was also again, Orson Scott Card is one of those who is like, yeah, there's a lot to there's a lot that I violently disagree with about Orson Scott Card's perspective in the world, and also and I think that there's a lot that is not just external to the work, but in the work is like flawed in a way. And also, it's also very, it's important to feel. It was important to me. Like, it was certainly formative. He definitely was. I mean, that's also, I think both of those things are also true of like Asimov and Heinlein and so on. That it was he's good enough and interested enough in the right things that when he's wrong, he's provocatively and wrong. I mean, not some of the times he's just dumb, just wrong. Like, I mean, his homophobia is not very interesting. It's just boring. But some of the things are he can talk compellingly about some things that are and so the Ender's Game, there's a really interesting takedown of it by John Kessel, and where, do you know what I'm talking about, Marianne? Where he's
I do. I think. I mean, I
you've
think
talked about it before.
Yeah.
Innocent killer. Yeah, where it's sort of like talking about how this it's worth reading it and then reading the essay by Kessel. I don't know that that's the only reading, but it's I'm not sure that Kessel really renders invalid any other reading of the book. But
well, I think Kessel really missed the point of the book. So as much as I like and respect Kessel, I just think that essay is badly missing the point. But anyway, so
well, I mean, what do you mean by missing the point? Because I think that
this is a long discussion. I don't think this is going to be. I think he really just doesn't understand what the series is doing. But that's. That's not something we can unpack quickly. So
okay.
I would say about Card is I think it is a real shame that his homophobia, which has done a lot of damage, because it's not just personal, but it is something that he has put out in public positions and so on, and which does show up in several of the books in pretty visible and I think damaging ways. It's a shame that this is what we have to talk about first, because I think there is a lot of value in his writing separate from that, and it's just very hard to separate it. But there is some what he does in terms of children, in terms of religion, in terms of power and political systems and ethics, I think are really interesting, and I hope at some point we get to the point where we can be talking about those with seriousness. And I don't know, it's tough with living authors. It's to do that, I think. So
they're in the way of
I mean, it really because there's like, well, I don't want to endorse, I don't want to send put more money headed way, but like you can talk about I don't know. Anyway, so
yeah. I mean, the people. I mean, who is it? I think Tolstoy was a terrible person.
Yeah. Well, many of them. Right?
Now it doesn't matter. You can.
Yeah.
You can just be interested in Tolstoy for whatever is interesting about Tolstoy, and you don't have to worry about whether he was a terrible husband. I mean, or you do have to worry about it because it informs the reading of the work, but it's not like you're worried about it actually impacting. Tolstoy's people he immediately affected as a living human. I don't know. I find it. One story that the Embracing the New, which I wrote at Clarion my first week, and was the first of my stories that was like nominated for something, Nebula, was partly in response to this thing in a writing book by Orson Scott. Orson Scott Card had like a how to write book that I remember being. We talked about this, I think, in the last episode that I was just that I it will not be dear listeners, we record these completely out of order. So when I say the last episode, this won't be the last episode from your perspective, but I just listened to an episode of our podcast where we talked about where do you get your ideas and what's your jam. And one thing that we talked about is being usefully frustrated with something. Like the thing that's most inspiring to read is not in a way something where you're just like, nah, I don't even relate to this, and not something where you're like, oh my God, this is so perfect, I couldn't change anything, but where you're like, yes, oh no, why? And because that's, in that moment, you're like, move over, let me take the wheel. That can be some of the most interesting things. And I relate to Card a little like that, where like some of the time I'm like, yes, some of the time I'm like, no. So that's
let me make
I wrote that story in reaction.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I just want to finish that thing.
Yep.
I wrote the story Embracing the New in reaction to his saying you can't write a story with just aliens, no humans. And I was like, watch me.
I think I can more articulately say what I wanted to say about Ender's Game, and which is I don't think you can consider Ender's Game by itself. You have to look at it in the sequence with at least Speaker for the Dead and to some extent Xenocide, the third book. Because I think the move he makes with those books is very similar to what Suzanne Collin does with Hunger Games, where in the first book, she gives you a feel-good story arc that ends on a triumphant note that, hooks the readers in, and you're like, yay, my young protagonist has saved the day. And then book 2 turns it on its head and starts undermining all of that, and you realize that this author is going to make you confront a lot of moral complexity that you didn't know was coming at you. And I think Speaker of the Dead does that brilliantly.
I think that's a great example, and I know we're not going to get into to the Kessel argument because that's be a different episode. But I'm not. But I feel, and I don't think the essay, I don't think Card's book collapses to Kessel's reading, and I don't think that. But I also don't think that perspective defeats the essay, because I think it's actually instructive to look at the difference between Hunger Games and the arc, because the arc is the same, I agree, and it's interesting, but there isn't comparing the two makes you notice the ways that the book protects Ender in a way that morally, like exculpates, like, of course it was his fault and it was a great tragedy and it's a genocide and he's guilty, then he goes and makes pilgrimage and apologizes and whatever, but there's a way in which he is, even in those later books, relieved of the burden of those consequences in a way that Katniss is not. Like that I think in some ways, looking at the whole series, it is more complicated, but it also kind of strengthens Kessel's point in some ways. But anyway, discussion for another time.
I would have to go reread Kessel's argument too before we actually had that conversation. So I think I was so irritated going through it the first time. I have to look at it again with a clearer head. And I love those books at the time. Like I found them thrilling, and I don't. It's not that to say that there's a, to say. Actually, I tell you what, I get a pleasure from both. Like, I get a pleasure from reading Ender's Game and I get a pleasure from Ender's Arc, and then to see Kessel pull aside the veil and be like, this kid is a sociopath, and this book is conspiring to make him, you know what I mean, to excuse him at every turn. Well, but that's the point. I don't think the book excuses him. But anyway, so I don't think the book is claiming he's not a sociopath. So that's where I think we have a very different reading of the series.
I don't know. Anyway, it's worth. I don't think that's the only reading of the book. I think your reading is perfectly legitimate. But I think that.
Thank you. That's very gracious of you.
Well, you have my seal of approval. No, but but I'm just saying, it's like I don't think. Well, it'd be worth. Whatever. Maybe if you read the essay, we argue about it. But I feel like it's supported by I guess what I'm talking about is there's a pleasure in going like, oh God, I didn't see that. Do you know what I mean?
No, I understand that. I just think it's wrong. So I just think it's wrong. I think he's, sure, if it were accurate, but it's not accurate. So anyway, we should let this go until we can do it properly. So. We're back. And I think our plan is we're going to talk about Le Guin and then maybe bring up some other authors that we haven't mentioned in the podcast yet, but that we think are exciting and worth discussing. So,
and the rest of them that are already on the list, you can go read on the list, because
that's right.
clearly at the rate we're going, we're not going to get through them.
Yeah.
Just one recommendation from me.
One recommendation from you. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Sounds good.
So Le Guin, what do you want to say about Le Guin? Ursula K. Le Guin. Ursula Kroger.
I mean, so again, like major like figure in my personal pantheon, totally vastly important. Le Guin is, also just her staying power is immensely impressive. Like the fact that she was doing, tremendously important things in the 60s, and then she, only died recently and really never stopped, like went from strength to strength. I think when she was in her 80s, she said, I don't have the energy for novels anymore. I'm writing, poetry and essays and things. But, and she was such a witty and deep and mischievous writer, and she's just a sense of the numinous. And, Wizard of Earthsea, of course, the first thing I read.
Me too.
For the, it was it's a kid series. Initially, and then takes a left turn, with Tanu, and it's a profound series. And when everybody else got into Harry Potter, which I read the couple of Harry Potters, and it was very well written and very cleverly done. The first book had I forget what it was, but it had a twist where I was honestly surprised. I was like, this is very well plotted, but I had trouble having any emotional connection to it, because I was just like, this is not the wizard school that I want. Because in a way, their take on magic and society and so on is just very opposite. I mean, Jed is like this, and I don't even know if it's Jed or Ged, but the hero of the somewhat hero of the Wizard of Earthsea is this taciturn, ambitious, sometimes unlikable, but never not super relatable, character from, who's like from the mountains and has no particular special destiny other than like having a talent for magic. And the main difference, so there's not that thing, but the main difference is that the magic is numinous. I feel like J.K. Rowling's magic is sort of like the most the take on it that I feel like sums up my feelings about J.K. Rowling's version of magic is like the Wizards of Waverly Place, where which is kind of a that was the sitcom with Selena Gomez, which is basically set in like Wizarding World, and the dad is always on the sitcom is always like, you can use a spell to send information to your friend who's across the world. And they're like, Dad, we have email. It's a way in which it's like all the ordinary things of life, except now with magic. And that feels like the opposite of what Le Guin does, because Le Guin magic is this costly bargain, this deep numinous, and the emblematic thing about Rowling is sending email with owls, and the emblematic thing about Le Guin's, about Earthsea's magic is what's his name? Jed's initial mentor, sitting in the rain, Ogion, sitting in the rain, and his apprentice being so pissed off that he won't just cast a rain spell, to move a cloud around. But the fact that he's a great wizard means he knows that moving the cloud will take the cloud from there to there, and there it will also have consequences. Like nothing is free. The more the more powerful you are, the least you want to pull at the strings of the world when you don't absolutely have to. This tremendously morally responsible take that's not like a couple of Latin words and then now you have a milkshake.
I love the way in which magic operates there, where it's about knowing the names of things, and including like, you need to know the name of every single teeny tiny little flower, right? And that way of seeing magic as basically being learning the truth of the world, as is what makes you a magician, or a wizard, is putting in the time and the effort and the mental energy to see clearly, is just so different as a framework from like, let me memorize a spell so I will have power, right? I think that question of power is much at the heart of the first book, I think, in Wizard of Earthsea, because she does sort of lead you through, I know you've come to this wanting power, magic as power, and we're now going to
right, exactly,
shatter you in the process,
yes.
right? Of searching
Jed
for that.
thinks he's going to Hogwarts.
Right, exactly. It'd be interesting at some point to do a comparison of magic schools. I just finished reading Naomi Novik's the second book in her Deadly Education series, which if you have not run into, they are delightful. I love Novik generally, but these two are absolute page turners. The Scholomance books, and the basic premise, which is given, told within the first chapter, is that all the kids with potential magical powers are sent to this school, which in theory is going to train them so that they will be safer as adults. But in the meantime, the school is trying to kill them, and like most of them are not going to make it to graduation. So it's
that's pretty intense.
And so it's like it's a really, like, if you grew up on Harry Potter, it's like it's anyway, it ends up
sounds like an anime.
Another
page turner.
Another wonderful. It does sound like an anime. Another wonderful interrogation. I mean, problematic in some ways, but interesting interrogation of the Rowling and Narnia tropes is Lev Grossman's The Magicians, which is really, really interesting, and also in some ways flawed in much the way its protagonist is, but really interesting.
The TV
take
series
on it.
is pretty good too.
Another thing that's not really about Wizarding School exactly, but that bears mentioning in this context of like interesting takes on magic, is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I also loved. Susanna Clark. Okay, but to take it back to Le Guin. The other thing about Le Guin that's present Earthsean in all of her stuff is the her, she's a Taoist. I actually read her a book that's quite important to me and I read a bunch of times was her translation of the Tao Te Ching, and an anarchist, and she has this very specific idea about how power works and how we work in the world, and how how it is a dangerous illusion that like there's something outside of us that's evil that we need to fight by defeating it, and then it'll go away, right? Which is not to say that we don't fight evil, you know what I mean? She's very super engaged, but the whole heart of the Earthsea trilogy is that he's trying to impose his will on the world to get what he wants, and thereby creates this shadow enemy, and that what in the end needs to happen is that is for him to accept the shadow enemy, that the only victory is healing, maybe, is the only final victory is healing, is really like the message of that cycle.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say one of her short stories, if you just wanted like, and The Man on the High Plains, that's not the title, it's something like that, and it's very much encapsulates a lot of that. Okay, I'm gonna stop because I'm like inarticulate. I should find the title.
She's also, the other thing is she's very like high and serious and numinous a lot of times. She's also very witty and like mischievous and delightfully like has this incredible like playful sense of humor, and there's all this and a lot of her characters are people who are like The Day Before the Revolution is a great short story, and which is really all about Odo, who's this philosopher, she's this woman who started this movement, and it's like the day before her like anarchist revolution is going to conquer the world. I think it may be a prequel of The Dispossessed in some ways, where Dispossessed takes place on a kind of troubled utopia. Anyway, but it's all about like just her ordinary day, I think, before like and she died. It's like she's it's like the last day of Odo's life in before the revolution. Anyway, very humane, very like there's Le Guin has tremendous grandeur and scope, and also tremendous like intimacy and delicacy of individual lives and everything. And she's very and she just also wrote everything, every kind of thing, like all her literary stuff is also like Sea Road, and those things are also really great. She's just a great line level writer too. And it's interesting, we were talking about Delaney's, whose prose is often pyrotechnic and intellectual and demanding and exciting, and Butler, whose prose is very, very, it's not always restrained, but always like razor sharp focused on exactly what the story needs to do. And I feel like Le Guin is, it's not one axis, so between them is not right, but she has this plethora of techniques in some ways. She's not necessarily, on the one hand, it's not that this is interesting for your clear glass, stained glass thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that she is calling attention to the writing precisely when she wants to. So she is not necessarily dazzling you with pyrotechnics of style, although it's often quite beautiful, but she often like addresses the reader or like, frames things in a way that is like someone is telling you the story, or, you know what I mean?
And she uses more experimental techniques too, like including bits of folklore that she's generated from the culture and so on. And, it's worth noting, I think, that she's the daughter of a pretty famous anthropologist.
Yeah.
And she grew up in a house where anthropologists were coming in, like hanging out and talking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the environment she grew up in. And I think it really influences the way she sees the world and how she puts different cultures up against each other and different ways of being, and asks us to think about how we navigate that. I remember the story I was trying to remember was called On the High Marsh, and it's in I think Tales of Earthsea, and I mention it mostly because it's again a meditation on power, but also if you loved Ged and you missed this story, he shows up in it, and it's well worth reading. It does a really good job with these questions of power and what magic
the anthropological stuff is really cool too.
And it's about healing. I think that's what triggered it. The short story is centered on healing from abusive power, essentially. So go on with the anthropological. You were going to.
Well, I was thinking of Solitude, which is a story set on a planet which essentially has where it's these anthropologists, basically, I guess, Hainish anthropologists, are going to a planet which is populated by people who have basically decided that anytime if an adult tells another adult something in order to try to get them to do it, like, which our culture runs on, spinning and marketing and whatever, like that's sorcery. You know what I mean? That's like you're stealing someone's will. And there's such a taboo on like that essentially the adults don't talk to one another. Like they're all living in their own solitary houses. And so it's interesting, like they raise children, like the children sort of, I think, wander around from place to place and are like taken care of and raised by these adults. But like eventually when they become adults, they are then alone because there's this fear of like what you would do to another person by, I think they like sometimes the adults come together in certain circumstances because they're children. So I guess they like have one night stands. But, there's this sort of, and it's just really interesting because it's so plausible as a way that humans could be. Le Guin, and it's not like a caricature, and it's not like it doesn't feel like oh, look at these, she inhabits these worlds so that you feel like that's wow, that would be a perfectly reasonable take on human existence, but it broadens your frame of what is possible, like what kinds of worlds there could be. And also the other thing is that she's very super critical of like I think all of the writers that we've talked about in our sort of pantheon here, and maybe this is one of the best things that science fiction can do, call into question like verities that we go around accepting quietly. But Le Guin, I think, is specifically militant about like, our kind of fast consumerist society and all of, and in specifically how that plays out in science fiction, that we think science fiction ought to be about us colonizing and going fast and building great things and having power. And it's this, I think that Le Guin's take is that this drive that animates particularly classic science fiction, she started writing in the 60s. So like in the midst of when she was first writing, like that is like this sort of stunted, like 8-year-old way of looking at the world. You know what I mean? It's like you didn't finish playing with your action figures. Like that's your relation. And so there's all these wise and mature far future worlds where people have decided that the thing you should probably do is just like take care of each other, tend your crops, and like die when you're 80, even though you could live till 300, but you would have to have a diseased perspective on the world to think that that you should like, exploit everyone around you and the resources of the world and everything in order to like get more. Like you're wise enough to like live the life that I don't know. It's just very interesting how her notion of it's like a counterbalance to a lot of science fiction sort of power hungry neophilia,
And I don't know enough about this. It would be really interesting to read like an Indigenous scholar's take on Le Guin and whether, her philosophies are resonant with those of other those of Indigenous people or not. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. But I think, again, like coming from that cultural anthropology perspective, I think she was exposed to a lot of alternatives to the contemporary culture that people might not have been otherwise exposed to. I also we can't not talk about what she does with gender. So I just want to, and you mentioned the anarchism. I didn't. Does she actually like? Would she call herself? Did she call herself an anarchist? Okay, so I don't know as much about that. I know the Dispossessed, is sort of exploring those issues, and I think if you're interested in that. I'd recommend also the work of Margaret Killjoy, who's a contemporary anarchist writer, and I think it'd be really interesting to connect those. But for me, I loved Wizard of Otzi. That's the trilogy. It was a trilogy when I was a kid, and then of course she added on to it. Left Hand of Darkness blew my mind. I mean, just what she did with gender in that book, but also the very lyrical, kind of oblique way she tells the story, where you are very slowly trekking across this snowy wasteland, just these two people in isolation, and you come to understand that they are in terrible danger, right? And that the stakes are incredibly high, but it's not a running around frantically kind of thing. And it's what she does. Enduring. Yeah, what she does with suspense and understatement is something that I think a lot of writers could learn from. That I often have students who, they want to write about something exciting, so they use big, exciting actions and big, exciting words. I want to send them off to Le Guin and be like, okay, go read this and see, like, if you pull back on everything, you can still get that effect you're looking for, and you might get it more effectively.
There's another tour de force in Le Guin. There's a page, I think, like the last bit of The Dispossessed, where I guess this is a spoiler in some sense, but not really, where Shevek, the protagonist, the plot demands that Shevek like have a breakthrough. Basically, like, this is obviously in the future, and so he's a physicist, and like, this is, so he's going to be the next Einstein on this page. Basically, he's going to like discover a thing that we don't know about. And that's always a difficult thing in science fiction. You're making up these things and you're like, well, and the fact that she pulls this off because essentially of the power of like the language and the poetry, like because you could easily cut away. You could easily be like, and then he discovered the next thing and we'll give it a fancy name and that's it. Which actually takes you through his experience of discovering this thing, which obviously she can't know what it is because it's like the thing that we haven't discovered yet. But it's like, it's just a tour de force of like of writing to be able to evoke that without, as you say, obliquely, like that there's like there's so much that's off the page. The other really interesting thing about Le Guin is how honest and brave she was, and the fact that she continually goes and revisits her earlier work and challenges it. So the great thing, one of the best things about Left Hand of Darkness is, read Left Hand of Darkness as it was published, and then go back and read Le Guin's essays, where she is first defending it and then 10 years later refuting her defense of it.
Well, so I love that so much.
Kind of an object lesson in humility, and we've talked about that too, I think.
Well, I wrote an essay about it for Tor.com, so people can go read that essay.
There you go.
So
link in the show notes.
Yeah. So it is, I think, very rare for writers to be able to continue to reevaluate their work. We talk about wisdom. She's interested in the question of wisdom. she is actually wise. I mean, this is one of those things to jump back to Bejeweled for a minute. One of the things I love about Bejeweled is that she tends to put it in dialogue, that her protagonists, her characters will say things that are like little pithy bits of wisdom, right? Like folk wisdom, but it's relevant to the, it's embedded in the language of the story and what's happening in that moment. And just as aspiring as a writer, I'm like, I don't know that I'd like to write like Bejeweled, but I don't know that I'm wise enough to come up with pithy little sentences that will encapsulate useful lessons for people. And so I don't know, maybe this is something that you only get later in life.
But yes, wise is a good word for both what Le Guin values and also exemplifies. That's probably enough about Le Guin, right? Is there more that we have to say about Le Guin?
I'm trying to think if there's anything we haven't. I mean, honestly, just go read a lot of Le Guin. I think,
we've mentioned before on the podcast Steering the Craft, which is her writing book of exercises.
Yeah, and it's a good book.
That's a good.
Yeah, and her essays are great. She's got a bunch of essays. She actually has a really significant essay called Science Fiction Mrs. Brown that asks the question of whether this the very complex character, such as she describes Mrs. Brown as this woman sitting on a train, can exist in science fiction. And I think if you're at all interested in questions of sort of archetypes, stereotypes, and characterization in the genre, it's essential reading. So
I think some of her, I mostly love her essays. I do think that sometimes she is what seems to me still fighting. I mean, it was very understandable from what she's talking about, but she's sort of she lived in a time, or she was mainly living in a time where, like, there was, for instance, this large literary prejudice against genre, for instance, where it was like, and so she's so often like, I don't know, I often find reading that just like, I know, it's like there's a little preaching to the choir in the sense that, but I don't think that she was. I mean, I think it was a fight that needed to be fought.
I don't actually think it's over yet. We've improved, but there's still a ways to go on that.
No, I'm sure. I think it's also my subject position, like were I the lone science fiction academic in a faculty of literary people, I'm sure I would find that very immediately relevant right now. But as it is, I'm like, yeah, of course, science fiction is.
I'd also point people to her National Book Award acceptance speech, in which she calls out. She uses it as a platform to do an incisive critique of the capitalism of the publishing industry. It is hilarious and quite bold and well worth watching that speech. So,
anyway, moving on from Le Guin, let's do another couple of like people not on the list.
I think Darius wanted to throw somebody in.
Oh, Darius wants to throw something in too.
You had a recommendation? Yeah.
Sorry, just unmuting. My favorite book, and I think everyone should read it at some point, is the Never-Ending Story, by Michael Ende, I think is the author. I used to read it every summer, every year, and I think it just has a lot to say about about like what it means to love, what it means to create, and what it means to like have an imagination, especially when the world can sometimes get so dark and be filled with like nothing, I guess, and how that could be so like all consuming, and how important it is to have an imagination, but also how important that imagination is rooted in love and love of those around you, and how you could have everything you want in life, but it almost means nothing if you don't have that important component of love. So I really just enjoyed Bastian's journey in the book, and especially the second half of the book, when he actually goes to Fantasia and learns some important lessons. So I don't know if you guys have anything to add, but Never-Ending Story.
I have not reread it every year. I read it as a teenager and I liked it a lot, and I sort of feel like maybe I should go back to it And I loved the movie, which I think only covers the first half of the book. Is that right? Yeah. So the movie is beautiful. The book is originally, I believe, was written in German and translated into English.
Yeah, it's big over here.
And so,
it's like that's like really the central text over,
oh, is it?
around
so maybe
here.
you
Like
could talk about
that's
that
like,
yeah.
well, I'm not the one to talk about it. I do think it's worth. I mean, I just know that like if you talk to people, like it's like the way that everybody in most people in America would, it would be Tolkien or it would be Narnia or something. It's like that's the thing here, But I think it's worth talking. I mean, I think it's we often underestimate like those, we've talked about Lloyd Alexander and Susan Cooper and everything, but Tove Jansson was another. Tove Jansson, like the Moomin Trolls, was a tremendously important for me as a kid. I think that sometimes we don't think of those children's authors as fantasists and in the same way, but that's like a lot of that is very crucial stuff. T.H. White, The Once and Future King, was like a big
that was important to me too.
Yeah, and even like I feel like even for like in the ways the first encounter we have with fantasy is often like even earlier than that, like Dr. Seuss and like Frog and Toad. You know what I mean? Like I think that so much of the I mean, those things hold up. Like a lot of them. I mean, okay, they took some Dr. Seuss off the shelf now because it had some like very sketchy racist tropes from the 40s or whatever. Although, like, not definitely should have taken it off the shelf. Like, don't like no parent who's just wandering the aisle should be buying like 30s and 40s caricatures of. But I do feel like there's a difference in. I mean, I could be wrong. It could come out that I'm wrong about this, but I just feel like there's a difference in, somebody who's been called on things and doubling down, like we were talking about Carr's homophobia, which is like a considered position. I am on the wrong side of history, versus I think, where Seuss is like, this is how we, you know what I mean? Like, absorbing ethnic stereotypes from the culture.
In some ways that matters less to me than,
Sure.
I think where I would end up with those texts is I really like, I think what they've done with, and I'm going to forget what the author is, these children's books, where they didn't change the original text, but they added framing at the beginning and the end of the book. So to sort of say, hey, parents, kids, just so you know, there's some problematic depictions here, and blah, 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 there's some racist terminology, and this is something you may want to keep in mind and consider, talk about with your kids, so on. And I think that's a really healthy way of approaching it.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think that's a different use case, because definitely like how you actually I had a blog post we could link to that I remember us talking about at some point about like entitled, I think, on how to read a racist book to your kids, like which is sort of where I think I was taking issue with. I mean, there was some New York Times author or something who was like wrestling with this problem and with a lot of, and I was like, I don't find this that hard with my kids. Like we read Asterix and they're like, why does this person look this way? And I'm like, well, at the time that this was written, this is not hard to explain to a 4-year-old. The time this was written, France was taking over another country. And so they were trying to act like the people there weren't really people. Like that's, they were confused, and that's sad. But like this is not like every 4-year-old is aware that people like make fun of people, that people like they're not confused that oppression exists. It's really more that like we want to protect parents from having to like say that out loud to their children. You know what I mean? Like it's the children are far more protected by you like communicating that everything is fine and we're gonna be together, and this isn't something that's overwhelming, but B, that like people are mean to people, and you can trust me to know that that's true, and when that happens anyway.
And to be clear,
I like the framing thing. I think that's a great way of handling it.
I'm okay with I think in those, the framing thing was often like, here is a book that is mostly fine, but there's this one scene that's a problem, right? As opposed to, some of the Seuss things are like problematic from page 1 to the end. And in that case, it's hard to frame it
Sure.
there. Maybe you do want to basically retire it and leave it in the archives.
Yeah, I mean,
for
I don't know.
Academics.
I mean, again, like retire.
Yeah.
Well, again, it's like, I think it's about context. I think it's really about like that. It isn't like, I don't think that it's.
I mean, if you can imagine,
definitely, if somebody is wandering around a bookstore trying to buy a book for their kid, this should not be like it's almost about user friendliness. Like, you know what I mean? It's almost like a usability problem. Like, don't, like, if there's a place where people could fall off, maybe put up a guardrail. You know what I mean? Like, it like just like saying, no, we put everything on the shelf and you can find out when you read to your kid the terrible stereotype. Like, that's not a good solution. But like, also, I don't know if you need necessarily like special permission and to go through 3 iron doors and into a sub basement and put on gloves to read it either. Like, surely there's a time and a place for like, this is the thing of this from this era that has this. You know, I think Huckleberry Finn is a great book, and I think that Twain is largely on the right side of history. I also don't think that, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that junior high school students should not be sitting there having to read a book where it's all like the worst racist epithet, right? Like that. I mean, that maybe there's a time and read The Room. You know what I mean? It's not that you have to sort things into like the pure things that are unsullied by oppression.
I understand. I was more saying, if we've got 100 Seuss books, context. It's not a tragedy if 2 of them aren't being
we can definitely
marketed, you know.
Exactly, which is what they did. It's like and people are up in arms about that because like, it's a private company. They are selling these books. They are well. It's perfectly reasonable business decision to be like, you can go find if Mulberry Street, whatever, in the library. Like, we are not going to sell it right now because the other Seuss books do not make anyone nauseous. Like, why not? Seems like a pretty sensible decision. Anyway.
All right, Darius is reminding us in text that we have strayed far afield.
Yes, we have strayed far afield.
Although I have one before we leave Neverending Story, I have a request for you. Now that I know that it's so huge in Switzerland where you are, I have a little holiday project that I've started of doing. I put up Christmas trees, and this year I'm working on a Narnia themed tree. I've got like my little Aslan figure. I've got a Mr. Tumnus, etc. I would love to do a Neverending Story tree. So if it is easy to buy, Falcor and Atreyu figures, you should talk to me about it, because I would be very interested.
I don't know about that. I and now that I say that, now I'm like announcing on the podcast that this is a big thing in Switzerland. Honestly, like, how many people have I talked to about this? Like, my sample size is not that great. Maybe Swiss listeners will be like, what is he talking about?
If we have Swiss German listeners out there and they're like, oh yes, there's Falcor ornaments in every Christmas store.
You also need the snake. The snake intertwining snake.
Maybe so.
Yes. So, all right.
I'm also not sure there's quite the same culture of turning everything into a toy that there. I don't know. But and also I think what there would be, I guess the Swiss thing is really Kasperle, but that you could maybe anyway, whatever. Never-ending story of fantasy books. Kasperle is really a radio stories. Yes.
I mean, I know you can get Moomin figures all over the place. So. Anyway,
maybe you can get Never-ending figures. Anyway, moving. So, Marianne, what is missing from our list that you want to throw out into the mix?
I want to say Joanna Russ. We never really. I don't think she really came up on the show, and I think she's so important.
Yeah.
She came up a few times.
A few times. All right. Well, Darius didn't put her on our list, which I think is a shame. So
should be on the list.
Yes, should be on the list, I think. She did such important work around gender and around, God, I don't know, anger. I feel like she's someone who really pushed back against the limits of what you were allowed to say, and
the female man is a absolutely quintessential.
I just love her work. I love her short stories. When It Changed, I love.
She's also quite funny, and The Adventures of Alex is
super
like,
funny,
hilarious.
Yeah, right. I think I've read almost all of her work. Picnic on Paradise, We Who Are About to, the two of them. Those are some of the novels. Definitely Adventures of Alex, which includes Picnic on Paradise. her famous book of essays, How to Suppress Women's Writing, I feel like should be mandatory reading in every English department at every university, right? Because it's so applicable beyond women's writing. It is a general, very funny and sharp analysis of these are the ways in which all kinds of work gets excluded from the canon, from the publishing industry, etc. We should every writer should go read it. And actually, Darius, now I'm like, sorry, I didn't make you read it when you were my student. So I'm going to make you read it.
Now you have to read it.
How to Suppress Women's Writing. I think, always my student. That's really nice. Okay, so yeah, and then she has a whole host of different essays out there. Another one who we lost much too young, and I think she would have been even more known and significant. All right, I guess she died at age 74, but it feels too young to me. I could have done with more of her. So yeah, and she's won all the awards. And rightfully so. And if you, and I think Delaney and Russ are often in conversation. Russ and Le Guin are often in literal conversation, and Tiptree, literal conversation. I think at the end of Letters to Tiptree, I think there's a set of letters that they exchanged that was fascinating.
That's I mean, I think both that movement, that which was the sort of when you were talking about when we were talking about Delaney, I guess I think I didn't say this, but like it's interesting in the context of everything that was going on then too, which was, sometimes at a remove, we like to call that the new wave. I know that Delaney is annoyed at that because there's a very specific sub-movement, which was the new wave, which I think there was like the Moorcock one, and then there was the Dangerous Visions one, and that there's at least three, and they're different, and they're totally different. But from my perspective, many years later, there was certainly this intellectual ferment in which there was this battle in science fiction between, much like some things we've lived through in our adulthood, but like there was this battle between an old guard and a bunch of insurgents, and who wanted, a lot of it was advocating for this sort of literary experimentalism and also psychedelia and whatever. And there's a lot of people who are less, like we've mentioned, a lot of the most important ones. I think the feminist wing of that, which is sort of what we're talking about, was really the milieu in which that was happening. But also important for Delaney, I think, in that context is like Dish and Zelazny and Sturgeon, and I mean there's that whole world of people going on. But I think Tiptree is really important. I mean, obviously there's also like there's been this recent reevaluation where they took the name off the award, which I think is a very good idea, because the Tiptree Award became the Otherwise Award, because of the circumstances of Tiptree's death and the fact that, largely I think because of the ableism implicit in how everyone had blithely assumed that that Tiptree killing herself and her husband was sort of, and I say this with heavy scare quotes, like an act of mercy. Like that's how it was like read by the, it was very quickly and easily accepted that way. And that there's been this recent evaluation that that's like a horrifically ableist, murderously literally ableist position. Anyway, I think this is what you were saying before. I mean, we're talking about Seuss and saying, well, this is, it's one thing if somebody like Card is doubling down on somebody who's absorbing from the culture. I think when I say that, you're right. Of course, what matters is the impact, and what matters is the framing and how we, what the impact is in the people and so on. It's a matter. But for me personally, and this is gonna vary for everybody, there's a difference of like, does what I know about this person now, given this thing, does it ruin it? You know what I mean? I don't find Woody Allen movies funny anymore. You know what I mean? Like it's not that I have some moral position that you should never separate the artist from the art.
I can't
it's just
watch,
like
I used to
Bill
love Cosby. I know, and
Cosby
I can't watch him
pudding,
anymore.
Not fucking funny anymore, right?
So,
like ruined, right?
And isn't it awful? Like I used to love that.
Yeah,
I loved it, and now I can't. Now I can't stand it.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's the least of the harm, no doubt. Like I mean, it's nothing compared to the people who actually suffered, but but like that's whereas with Tiptree, I mean, that's we don't know what happened. There is every reason to assume that it was definitely not okay. We should not throw under the bus the people for whom that's a showstopper. And for me, it does not. It's a horrifying culmination to like a lot of what the damage that you can see in the work, but it doesn't diminish Tiptree's work in a way. You know what I mean?
I think, my take on this is modified by the fact that, I'm an academic that studies this, right? And that teaches it. And so I almost feel like I have to be able to separate out my personal opinion and what I would choose to read for pleasure or promote from, what is important to the field. And so Tiptree, even if Tiptree were a mass murderer, even if, you could pile on the atrocities. And I would still say this writing is significant to the field. It is important to humanity in some sense. And so we have to be able to discuss that. But that's a very separate thing. I want to come back to Russ. I feel like we segued into Tiptree.
Sure.
And I'm going to connect them because I was glancing at the Wikipedia page on Russ and what we were saying about anger. And I think whoever wrote this did a very nice job. There's a paragraph here. Russ's writing is characterized by anger interspersed with humor and irony. And then James Tiptree Jr. In a letter to her wrote, quote, "Do you imagine that anyone with half-functional neuron can read your work and not have his fingers smoked by the bitter, multi-layered anger in it? It smells and smolders like a volcano, buried so long and deadly, it is just beginning to wonder if it can explode." And then in a letter to Susan Koppelman, Russ asks of a young feminist critic, where is her anger? And adds, I think from now on, I will not trust anyone who isn't angry. And so for me, that really encapsulates a lot of current social justice conversations that I'm having. We, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and just last night, I was pulled into a school board meeting where we were discussing there'd been a recent cancellation of sports activities and because of COVID and pushback from a group of parents that were largely white, and the young Black and Latinx student group spoke up at the board meeting and read a statement where they said, when we were protesting the giving of failing grades last spring, where was the PR? Where was the outrage? Where were the parents turning out in support? Why isn't anyone else angry about this? Essentially, you were over here being furious about a sports thing being canceled, which definitely has ramifications for college and so on. It's not to say that isn't also significant, but why is it so much easier to get CBS News showing up to cover this instead of covering what we're, fighting for our lives with? And I think that's where Russ is so useful to me. I feel like I'm very culturally trained to not get angry. I mostly don't get angry, and I have a hard time even accessing my anger in my writing and my thinking. I mean, it's probably there, but it's so like, if you show your anger as a brown woman, people start dismissing you as hysterical, as like not taking you seriously. And I see this in governance all the time. There are, brown women on local boards who get angry and they immediately get discredited and their positions are discounted, and people, and so it's, I don't know, it just becomes this incredibly frustrating balancing act between speaking with sincerity and letting my frustration and righteous anger fuel my arguments without ever sounding angry. Right. And I think that is exactly what Russ is talking about and demonstrating in a lot of her work. And this is part of why I think it's so important for everyone to go back and read her if you're involved with any kind of social justice, or however you want to frame that, civil rights fights, just as a pure tactical thing. So
I think also I mean, Butler too is in that
Mm-hmm.
category too. And in some ways, it does feel like those are like, this is, these things that people are writing in the 60s and 70s and 80s are like guides to surviving in a world where, I don't know, like there is like, what do you do with, the outrageousness of like, and potential despair of like, the world around you. And I think it's, I think the Trump era uh, did some work in like stripping away the sort of briefly at least like the kind of complacence or the complacency about where it's which made it easy for privileged people often to uh, benignly assume that everything, you know what I mean, that and so but it's kind of it's I think of the parable of the sower and Butler's sort of very explicit guidelines to how to live in a world, specifically in America, in like epical decline. You know what I mean? And in which the social contract is deteriorating. Like it's but yeah, and the thing about Russ and Tiptree has the same kind of anger. I feel like Russ's anger is I don't know. I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about the difference between them, but it feels like Russ knows exactly. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, they're interesting read in combination. Maybe I'll just say that.
Yeah. So I think are heading towards wrapping up. Do you want to throw
the last
in...
person I want to mention is who I feel like has been partly because I feel like it's relatively little known. Like I don't hear nearly as much about it, and it's been very important to me. And unlike a lot of the stuff, this is stuff I've read relatively recently, in the last 10 years or so, is Elemental Logic, Laurie J. Marks series, which I think has a lot of that same Le Guinian moral complexity and sense that the world is that impatience with easy answers that often fantasy and science fiction has, sort of like, if you defeat the Dark Lord and get the MacGuffin, yay, we win. There's this rejection of that. And I think you were saying you read the first book. The interesting thing about that series is 4 books in the Elemental Logic series, and I mean it does a lot of fun stuff. It's cool. I mean, it's this great like queer found family, poly queer found family epic, and also this kind of it has the grandeur of epic fantasy. It has everything you got from Tolkien. All of this like intense, deep magic, and things at stake, with like this grown up moral reasoning. You know what I mean? And so the interesting thing is that the whole like I mean I hesitate a little bit to spoiler this, but I don't think it's a spoiler exactly. When Tolkien thinks we're done, when Tolkien thinks that the goal has been achieved and like victory is at hand, in Laurie J. Marks, that we are halfway. You know what I mean? Like the healing is just as important. The how do you deal with the aftermath of like you know what I mean? Like the book starts with like clear oppression in charge and our insurgent heroes trying to overthrow it. And it's funny, Star Wars, that's Star Wars' plot, right? And in Star Wars, because it's multiple generations now, it always elides the part where everything goes wrong, right? In a way, it's like, yay, Return of the Jedi, and then somehow everything was bad again. Oh, well, we're in episode 7. We have to, it's like the part. But the more interesting thing is not just like everything goes bad again and we elide that, but like how do you get from winning to actually healing, like victory, like having now that you're on top and those guys are down. That is not the end of the story. Like that is, and I feel like it has such a, even if there were no girls kissing girls and boys kissing boys in this epic, it has this deeply queer sensibility about like the received verities of the world and how constricting they are and how much redemptive work there is in recreating what it means to be like who you need to be, and and in community, that is really just a really powerful take.
So I have now, while you were talking, gone and bought a Kindle edition of Fire Logic. So I'm going to reread it. As I told Ben offline, I read it, I think, when it first came out, and I enjoyed it, but then it was a wait for the next book, and so I just never got back to it. So I'm going to read it, and Kindle binging being what it is, I suspect I will then go on and just read the next 3 in quick succession. But I'm going to invite you to read Guy Gabriel Kay's The Summer Tree, which is the first in his Fionnevar trilogy, which does not do the thing that bugs you about Kay.
Summer Tree.
So
do the thing that bugs me.
Yeah.
Did we talk on camera about the thing that bugged me?
No, we did not. Well, we might have on another episode. I'm not sure, but
the Summer Tree. Yeah.
Ben is frustrated by the way in which Kay uses sort of pseudo-historical settings that are sort of like they're history-inspired settings for many of his books, most of his books. But
to be clear, I'm not frustrated in the sense that I disapprove of it. It just makes my brain. Like I cannot pay attention to the story because I'm trying to figure out what's real.
But his first trilogy, his first trilogy doesn't do that at all. It's just
Sounds good.
It is maybe not quite as strong writing wise, but I love it to pieces, and so I'd love to talk to you about it if you end up liking it.
We will have a future episode where we have gone and read each other's faves and have reactions. That's cool. The elemental logic stuff had part of the reason you may have been thrown off the train is it had a relatively checkered publishing history, I think, because it got the first 2 got published in sort of very pulp-ish covers, kind of, I don't know, by Tor or somebody, Del Rey or somebody, like some mainstream house, and then it got dropped, I think, and then got picked up by Small Beer, which has now reissued all of them. So it's
got it.
Okay, right. I'm writing down The Summer Tree.
The Summer Tree. Book 1 of the Fionnevar Tapestry. I love this so much that I read this book as a trilogy when I was a young teen, and then they disappeared from my local library, and someone checked them out and never returned them, and I spent something like 2 decades looking for it pathetically every time I was in a used bookstore, et cetera, because I so wanted to reread them and I couldn't find them. And finally they were reprinted and now they are easily accessible. Nice. So we are going to wrap with reading out to you guys the list of the Kickstarter backers. And who helped us launch this podcast. We're so grateful to these couple of dozen people who put in a little early money to help us get off the ground. Darius puts in a lot of time into editing our audio and video. Ben and I just natter. And so we're really glad that we can pay him for this work. If you'd like to support us, I think we're going to try and figure out how to have a Patreon and so on so that you can more effectively support us. And I think that will be added to the end of the show notes at some point.
I will say we technically do have one, but I think it's worth looking at it again and making sure it's.
We'll make sure there's a way.
And there's a SLF. Does the SLF have a?
You can, of course.
We're a project of the SLF.
We're a project of the SLF, and you can certainly donate. You can become a member for $2 a month, and we're about to launch. I don't know when you'll hear this. We're about to launch a Discord community where you can come hang out with us and have more of these conversations. There probably will be by the time this comes out, a Discord community for members. I think we're just going to read out the list. We're going to trade off names. Does that sound good, Ben?
Let's do 4 each.
4 each. Okay, here we go. Thank you so much, Kickstarter backers. Corey Liss, Shannon R., C.A. Bridges, Molly Gordon.
Thank you to James Clark, Michael Haynes, Brooks Moses, and Jed Hartman.
Thank you, Stephen Schwartz, Mark Frey, Dale Larson, and MG.
And Teresa Roberts, Michelle Biddick Simmons, D. Franklin, and Quiff Winnig.
All right. Robert Skopatz, Marcel, Kagoyohime, Heather Toomey.
KM Viehongs, Allison Miller Henle, Curtis, and Dane.
Sarah Jolie, Michael Hanneman, Mer Lafferty, Hale Fanner Ethan.
Robin White, Tasha Turner, Najim Huck, and Dr. Dana Jackson.
Thank you to Janet Laffler, Ellen Kushner, Sarah Peters, Mary Haskell.
Thank you to Swadaby, Lisa Eckstein, Mary Haldeman, Charlie Jane Anders.
Thanks to Stephanie Burgess, Wendy Schaefer, Jean, Shannon John Clark, and finally, Marianne. Not me, a different Marianne.
Marianne.
And I feel that we let me just add an apology in that we committed the canonical sin of not looking at the names and practicing the pronunciation ahead of time.
Yes,
I think we did mostly okay.
Got some of them wrong.
But I'm pretty sure we got some of them wrong. So you are very appreciated, and thank you for your patience with us. Thanks, everybody. It's been this is like a closing off season 1. I've had a really great time. I hope everyone's enjoyed listening to it. So and we'll be back with season 2.
Let's do it again.
At some undetermined future point, but in not too long, we think.
There's a few more episodes released for season 1, but I think the bulk of everything we've recorded is done. So
yeah, it's been a lot.
Yes.
There's going to be more. You're going to be listening to us for a long, long time. So
thank you, everyone.
Lullaby.
All right. Take care. Thanks.